Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I started dealing with chronic pain when I was 16. It began in my joints, my wrists, knees, shoulders. At first, my parents thought I was being dramatic, but when I started having trouble opening jars or walking upstairs without wincing, they finally took me to see our family doctor. That first doctor was pretty good. He ran some tests, asked detailed questions, and referred me to a specialist. The specialist did more tests and said I had something called joint hypermobility syndrome. My joints are too flexible and they don't stay in place properly, which causes pain and makes me prone to injuries. For 3 years, I managed it with physical therapy and pain medication when things got really bad. But when I turned 19 and started college, I had to switch to a new doctor because I moved to a different city for school. My old specialist had written detailed notes about my condition and treatment plan, so I figured the transition would be smooth. The new doctor's office was in one of those medical buildings that always smell like disinfectant and have uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting room. I've been having a bad flare-up for about 2 weeks. My wrists were constantly aching, and I dislocated my shoulder twice just from reaching for things in my dorm room. When they finally called me in, I was greeted by a middle-aged doctor who barely looked up from his computer when I walked in. He had that attitude some doctors get where they think they've seen everything and know better than anyone else, especially young patients. He asked what brought me in that day, and I explained that I've been having a flare-up of my joint hypermobility syndrome. I told him my previous specialist had recommended I find a new doctor for ongoing care, and I needed to discuss my pain management options. He finally looked at me, and I could already see the skepticism in his eyes. He questioned how old I was again, and when I said 19, he asked who had diagnosed me with this condition. I gave him the name of my previous specialist and explained that I had all my medical records with me, but instead of looking at them, he just leaned back in his chair and gave me this condescending smile. He told me he saw a lot of young women who came in thinking they had all sorts of exotic conditions. He said most of the time it was just stress or anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms. I tried to explain that I had documentation from my previous doctor and I've been managing this condition for 3 years now, but he just asked if I've been under a lot of pressure lately, saying that starting college could be very stressful for young people. I could feel my frustration building. This wasn't the first time a doctor had dismissed my symptoms, but I thought those days were behind me after getting a proper diagnosis. I insisted this wasn't about stress and that my joints literally dislocated. I told him I had a medical condition that had been documented and treated. He then said something that made my blood boil. He suggested that sometimes when young women were lonely or anxious, they focused on their bodies in unhealthy ways. He asked if I considered that maybe what I really needed was some social interaction. Maybe a boyfriend to distract me from these concerns. I stared at him. I asked if he was seriously suggesting that having a boyfriend would fix my joint hypermobility syndrome. He replied that he was saying young women often benefited from having other things to focus on besides perceived health issues. He claimed anxiety could manifest in very convincing physical symptoms. That's when I'd had enough. I reached for the water bottle I brought with me and set it down on the examination table. I asked him if he thought this was anxiety, then grabbed my left wrist with my right hand and deliberately hyperextended it until the joint made a loud, wet, popping sound. The doctor's face immediately went pale. I asked him if he thought anxiety could do what he'd just witnessed. I could see him trying not to look at my wrist, which was now bent at an angle that definitely wasn't normal. His whole demeanor changed instantly. He stammered and asked how I had done that, clearly disturbed by what he'd seen. I explained that this was what joint hypermobility syndrome looked like. I told him this was what I've been trying to tell him about, that my joints don't work the way they're supposed to. He actually gagged and had to turn away from me. When he finally composed himself, he was suddenly very interested in looking at my medical records. He said he thought we should get me referred to someone who specialized in these types of conditions. I sarcastically asked if he meant like the specialist I was already seeing before I moved here. He quickly agreed, saying exactly like that. He spent the next 10 minutes frantically typing up a referral and apologizing for what he called a miscommunication. He even offered to fast-track the referral so I could be seen within the week instead of waiting a month like usual. When I was leaving, the nurse at the front desk gave me a knowing look. She asked if this was my first time seeing him. I told her it was my first and last time. She said that was a smart choice, mentioning they'd had a few complaints about his bedside manner, especially with younger female patients. I got my referral that same day, and within a week I was seeing a new specialist who actually listened to me and took my condition seriously. A few years back, I got a job at a small family-owned business. I had just finished my accounting degree and needed somewhere to put my skills to work. The company did construction and maintenance work, nothing too fancy, but they needed someone to handle their books and payroll. The owner seemed decent during the interview, and the pay was fair for a recent graduate. My role was straightforward. I managed all the accounting and payroll for about 64 employees total. 10 of us worked in the main office. 4 more were based in the shop out back working on equipment and preparing materials, and around 50 workers were scattered across various job sites throughout the city. I had 2 people reporting directly to me, and I answered to the owner himself. It felt good to have real responsibility right out of college. The office dynamic was mostly pleasant, except for one major problem. The receptionist had been there since the company started, and she never let anyone forget it. Let me call her Karen, because if you've ever met someone who fits that stereotype perfectly, this was her. She acted like she owned the place just because she had seniority. Karen's official duties were typical receptionist stuff. She answered phones, greeted visitors, handled mail, and occasionally ran personal errands for the owner and his wife. Things like picking up their dog from the groomer or dropping off dry cleaning. But Karen had turned her position into some kind of power trip. She would police everyone's arrival times like she was a hall monitor. If someone walked in even 2 minutes late, she'd make this big show of looking at her watch and raising her eyebrows. The dramatic arm gestures and finger tapping were so over the top that it would have been funny if it wasn't so annoying, but the real problem was how she treated people she didn't like. Karen had created this weird hierarchy in her head where she decided who deserved good service and who didn't. If you weren't in her inner circle, suddenly everything took forever. Need a package shipped out. It might sit on her desk for 3 days. Want to schedule a meeting. She claimed the owner's calendar was completely booked for weeks. Need office supplies ordered. Well, she'd get around to it eventually. Most of us just started doing these tasks ourselves rather than deal with her attitude. It was easier than the constant friction, even though it meant we were basically doing parts of her job for her. The owner had this nice habit of stopping by Costco and picking up treats for everyone. He'd grab a big box of granola bars, candy bars, or other snacks and put them in the office kitchen with a note saying they were for everyone to enjoy. It was a small gesture, but it meant something to the team. One day, he brought in a box of Snickers bars. I was working at my desk when I saw Karen practically skip to the kitchen. When she walked back past my office door, I noticed her arms were full. She was trying to be sneaky about it, but she had clearly grabbed way more than just one candy bar. Later that afternoon, one of the shop guys came into the office to drop off some paperwork. I told him he should grab a Snickers from the kitchen on his way out. He laughed and asked if Karen knew about the candy bars, because if she did, there wouldn't be any left. He explained that every time the boss brought in snacks, she would take a bunch and hide them at her desk. He said all the shop workers had noticed this pattern. I walked to the kitchen to check, and sure enough, there was exactly one candy bar left out of what had clearly been a full box. The empty cardboard container was still sitting there. Normally, I would have just rolled my eyes and moved on. It's petty office drama, and there are bigger things to worry about. But this pattern kept repeating itself. New box of treats appears, Karen makes her rounds, and suddenly, there's barely anything left for 60 other people to share. Still, I minded my own business, until Karen made a big mistake a couple months later. The owner called me into his office looking stressed. He had a tax penalty notice in his hand and wanted to know what was going on. My heart sank because I thought I had missed something important. He told me the notice had come in that day's mail and asked me to explain the penalty. I looked at the notice and immediately knew something was wrong. We had filed everything on time and paid all our taxes. I asked to see the envelope, and that's when I realized what had happened. The mail had been opened and was sitting on the owner's desk, not mine where it should have been delivered. It turned out that Karen had gone through the mail on my desk, which she absolutely was not supposed to do. When she saw this official-looking penalty notice, she saw an opportunity to cause trouble for me and ran straight to the owner with it. After about 15 minutes of panic, some phone calls, and digging through files, we figured out what had actually happened. The state had implemented a new computer system that mistakenly generated penalty letters for every business in the county. We weren't the only ones who got these bogus notices, but Karen had tried to throw me under the bus, and now I was angry. A few weeks later, I got my chance. Karen was out running errands for the owner when he came to her desk looking for paper clips. I offered to help him search and suggested we check her drawers for office supplies. When we opened the bottom drawer, it was like discovering buried treasure. There were somewhere between 35 and 40 candy bars stashed in there. Snickers, Kit Kats, granola bars, and other treats from various boxes the owner had brought in over the past few months. The owner went completely silent for a moment. Then he carefully gathered every single candy bar and carried them to his office, laying them out on his desk like evidence. I could see the wheels turning in his head when he realized why his boxes of treats for the entire office were always empty so quickly. When Karen returned from her errands, she put her purse down and immediately went to her drawer for her afternoon snack. I watched from my office when her face went through several expressions. First confusion when the drawer was empty, then shock when she realized what had happened. Then she turned white when the owner appeared and asked her to come to his office for a minute. I didn't hear the entire conversation, but the owner filled me in later. Karen had actually tried to justify her hoarding by claiming she deserved a fair share of the candy because she worked harder than everyone else in the office. She said that when a new box appeared, she was just taking what she was owed and saving it for later. Over time, her definition of fair share had grown to mean how many candy bars she could carry back to her desk without looking ridiculous. The owner told her she was getting a formal reprimand for this behavior. From now on, when he brought treats, she would have to wait a full day before taking anything. Everyone else would get first crack at the snacks. Karen was mortally embarrassed and barely spoke for the rest of the week. For the next couple of years until I eventually moved on to another job, she was much more reasonable and professional. But the funniest part was watching her face whenever the owner brought in new treats. She'd look at that box like a scolded dog staring at food it wasn't allowed to have. The owner took all those hoarded candy bars out to the shop and distributed them to the guys working back there. The next day, one of the shop workers came into the office with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. He told me that the Snickers he ate yesterday was the sweetest candy bar he'd ever tasted. Karen never hoarded snacks again. I moved into this quiet neighborhood about 2 years ago after finally scraping together enough money for a down payment on my first house. After years of apartment living where I had to circle blocks just to find street parking, having a house where I could park right in front of my own door felt like luxury. The house next door had been empty when I moved in, but about 6 months later this woman moved in with her teenage daughter. At first, she seemed friendly enough. We'd wave when we saw each other, make small talk about the weather, nothing deep but neighborly. Things started getting weird about 3 months ago. She began leaving passive-aggressive notes on my windshield about how I was parking too close to her driveway, even though I was clearly in front of my own house and nowhere near blocking anything. Then she started timing her departures with mine, always managing to come outside and make comments about my parking habits. The breaking point came yesterday. I'd just gotten home from my weekly grocery run. You know the drill, trunk loaded with enough food to survive the apocalypse because somehow a quick trip to the store always turns into a $200 adventure. I parked in my usual spot right in front of my house where I always park and started hauling bags toward my front door. That's when she appeared like she'd been watching through her window, waiting for me. She asked me not to park there today. I stopped mid-stride, a bag of groceries in each hand, and just stared at her. When I asked her what she meant, she explained that she had people coming over for her daughter's birthday party, and they would need that spot for parking. I looked at my car, then at my house, then back at her, trying to process what I was hearing. I asked her if she really wanted me to move my car from in front of my house for her guests. She said yes, just for today, and that it would really help her out. The audacity was breathtaking. I had dealt with entitled people before, worked retail for 3 years, so I thought I'd seen it all. But this was next level. I told her no. She tried to convince me to be reasonable, saying it was just one day. I explained that I was being reasonable, that this was my house and where I parked my car, and that her friends could figure out parking like everyone else does. She accused me of being selfish and reminded me it was her daughter's birthday. I told her that was great for her daughter, but it didn't change the fact that this was my house and my parking spot. Then she got clever and pointed out that it was a public street, and I didn't own it. I agreed with her completely. It was indeed a public street, which meant her guests could park anywhere on this public street that wasn't directly in front of my house. She stood there sputtering for a moment, like she couldn't believe someone was actually telling her no. Finally, she said fine, but when her guests couldn't find parking and had to walk 6 blocks, that would be on me. She walked back toward her house, complaining about what a terrible neighbor I was and how inconsiderate I was being. She said she didn't know why some people even bothered living in communities. I just shook my head and continued carrying my groceries inside. 20 minutes later, I heard cars pulling up. I peeked out my window to see what would happen. 3 cars had arrived for the party. One parked directly across the street. Another found a spot 2 houses down. The third parked behind the second car. Everyone managed to park within a reasonable walking distance, just like normal people do every single day. Around 7 that evening, I noticed a tow truck creeping slowly down our street. I watched as it stopped right in front of my house. The driver got out and started walking toward Karen's front door. That's when I realized what had happened. In her entitled fury, Karen had apparently called the city and reported my car as illegally parked or blocking access or some other nonsense. Here's the thing about living in this neighborhood for 2 years. I know exactly where I can and cannot park. I checked all the local parking regulations when I moved in. I walked outside as the tow truck driver was talking to Karen on her front porch. He was explaining to her that he'd looked at the vehicle in question, and it was legally parked with no violation. Karen insisted that my car was blocking access to her driveway. The driver told her he'd measured it himself and that my vehicle was parked entirely in front of the adjacent property and wasn't blocking her driveway access by any legal standard. Karen got more frustrated and declared that this was ridiculous because she paid taxes in this neighborhood. The driver reminded her that everyone else paid taxes too, and that he couldn't tow a legally parked vehicle just because she didn't like where it was. The driver walked back to his truck and drove away, leaving Karen standing on her porch looking like she'd swallowed a lemon. Several of her party guests had come outside during the commotion and were now staring at her with obvious embarrassment. One of the other parents from the party approached her and suggested that maybe they should head inside and get back to the kids. Karen continued complaining about how selfish some people were, especially on her daughter's birthday. But I could tell her audience wasn't buying it. The other parents exchanged looks that clearly said they thought she was being ridiculous. The party wrapped up about an hour later, and when the guests were leaving, I happened to be checking my mail. I overheard 2 of the parents talking when they walked to their cars. One said she couldn't believe that Karen had called a tow truck on her own neighbor. The other agreed, saying it was over a parking spot that wasn't even blocking anything, and that the poor guy was just parked in front of his own house. The first parent said that if they were in my position, they'd be looking into filing a harassment complaint. And you know what? They weren't wrong. I spent that evening researching local harassment and nuisance laws. Turns out, Repeatedly filing false reports about legally parked vehicles can actually get you in trouble with the city. I haven't had to use that information yet, but it's nice to know I have options if Karen's entitled behavior escalates. For now, I just continue parking in front of my own house like a normal person, and she continues to glare at me from her window like I've somehow wronged her by existing in my own space. 5 years of being a security guard at Central Station downtown taught me to expect the unexpected. Drunk people falling onto tracks, pickpockets, the usual city problems, but nothing prepared me for what happened last Tuesday. I was doing my usual rounds around the platform during rush hour. The 6:15 train was about to arrive and people were crowding near the yellow safety line. That's when I noticed this woman having what looked like a heated argument with a guy near the edge of the platform. She was gesturing wildly with her hands, and even from where I stood about 20 feet away, I could tell she was furious. The woman looked to be in her 30s, wearing a business suit. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she had that look that screamed trouble. The guy she was arguing with seemed uncomfortable, like he was trying to back away from her. I started walking toward them, but I was still too far when I heard the train approaching. That's when things went sideways fast. Karen was screaming at the guy, asking him how he could throw her away like garbage after everything she had done for him. The guy looked exhausted and told her he had already explained that it was over and begged her to leave him alone. She got even more furious and yelled that he had ruined her life. The guy tried to step back, but Karen grabbed his arm. I started jogging toward them because something felt wrong. Really wrong. He tried to pull away and told her seriously to let go of him. That's when she said something about him wanting her to let go, and that she would do exactly that. That's when she shoved him. Hard. Right when the train was pulling into the station. Time slowed down like in those action movies. I saw the guy stumble backward, his arms flailing when he tried to catch his balance, but there was nothing to grab onto. He fell backward onto the tracks just when the train's headlight lit up the tunnel. I dropped everything and sprinted toward them. A couple other people on the platform saw what happened and started screaming. The two guys near the tracks immediately jumped down to help the fallen man, while others were yelling at the train conductor to stop. But Karen just turned around and started walking away like nothing happened, like she hadn't just tried to commit murder. I shouted at her to stop right where she was. She heard me yelling and broke into a run. She was fast, but I run 5 miles every morning before work. She wasn't getting away from me. I chased her through the station, past confused commuters and food vendors. She knocked over a coffee cart trying to slow me down, but I jumped over the mess and kept going. She made it to the stairs leading to street level before I caught up with her. I yelled that she wasn't going anywhere and tackled her right there on the concrete steps. She went down hard, and I heard her suit tear when she scraped against the rough surface. She started screaming for help and claiming that I was attacking her for no reason. She started swinging at me, trying to scratch my face with her nails. One of them caught me across the cheek, drawing blood. I told her to stop fighting because she had just tried to kill someone. She claimed she had no idea what I was talking about and kept thrashing around, trying to get free. In the struggle, she ended up with cuts on her arms from scraping against the steps and a bruise forming on her forehead where she hit the concrete. She yelled that I had no right to touch her and that she was calling her lawyer. I told her good luck with that from jail. I managed to pin her down until I heard sirens approaching. Someone must have called the cops. 2 officers came running up the stairs, and I quickly explained what had happened. One of the officers asked me to step back and said they would handle it from there. I let go of Karen and stepped aside. She immediately started putting on a show for the cops. She thanked the officers for coming and called me a maniac who had attacked her for no reason. She demanded to press charges against me. The officer told her to calm down and explained that they had multiple witnesses saying she had pushed someone onto the train tracks. She called that ridiculous and insisted she would never do such a thing. The officers handcuffed her while she continued protesting her innocence. One of them took my statement while the other radioed down to the platform to check on the situation. I asked if the guy she pushed was okay. The officer told me that 2 civilians had pulled him out just in time and that paramedics were checking him over but he appeared to be uninjured. He said I had probably saved his life by stopping her from leaving the scene. That's when Karen finally cracked. Maybe it was realizing she wasn't going to talk her way out of this, or maybe the adrenaline was wearing off. She started ranting about how he had broken up with her after 2 years together, calling her too intense and blocking her number. She admitted to pushing him and said he deserved it for what he had put her through. The officers looked at each other. One of them shook his head. The officer told her she had just confessed to attempted murder. She screamed back that it wasn't attempted murder but justice instead. They led her away, still ranting about how unfair everyone was being to her. I watched when they put her in the back of the police car, her expensive suit now torn and dirty. Later, I found out more details from the detective who took my full statement. Karen had been stalking her ex-boyfriend for weeks after he broke up with her. She'd been showing up at his work, following him home, and sending him hundreds of text messages from different phone numbers. He'd been documenting everything for a restraining order. The detective told me that without my intervention, they probably never would have caught her. She had planned to disappear into the crowd and claim she was never there. The security cameras were at the wrong angle to clearly show what happened, so it would have been her word against witness testimony. 3 months later, I got called to testify at her trial. Karen sat there in an orange jumpsuit, still maintaining that she was the real victim in all this. Her lawyer tried to argue temporary insanity, but the prosecution had phone records showing she'd been planning to confront her ex that day. The jury took less than 2 hours to find her guilty of attempted murder and stalking. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison. When they led her away, she was still screaming about how unfair it all was. Her ex-boyfriend came up to me after the trial and shook my hand. He told me he had been living in fear for months, wondering when she might try something like this again. He said now he could finally move on with his life. I went back to work the next day like nothing happened. But now I pay extra attention to heated arguments on the platform. You never know when someone might snap and do something unthinkable. I'm 27 and work remotely for a tech company, which gives me pretty good flexibility with my schedule. About 8 months ago, this woman I barely knew from childhood reached out to me. Our dads used to work together when we were kids, but we weren't friends or anything. She was moving to my city and was 5 months pregnant at the time. She contacted me through social media saying she didn't know anyone here and asked if we could hang out. I felt bad for her because I remembered how lonely it was when I first moved here 3 years ago. I didn't know a single person and spent my first few months pretty isolated. So I figured, why not help someone else avoid that experience? At first, everything seemed normal. She didn't have a car, so I offered to drive her around to look at apartments. I helped her run errands, took her grocery shopping, that kind of stuff. When my dad came to visit for a weekend, we even spent the whole time helping her move into her new place and building her furniture. She seemed grateful, and I felt good about helping someone who really needed it. The baby's father wasn't in the picture at all, and she was unemployed. I honestly have no idea how she was paying for everything, the apartment, groceries, all her stuff, but I didn't ask because it wasn't really my business. I just wanted to be a good person and help her get settled. I even introduced her to some of my friend group when we all went out for drinks one night. Big mistake. She was incredibly rude to them, making snide comments about their clothes and jobs. Then afterwards, she wouldn't stop trash talking them to me. She told me my friends were fake and that one of the girls was giving her dirty looks all night. When I tried to explain that they were actually being nice, she said I was too trusting and that she could tell when people were being fake. That should have been my first red flag, but I brushed it off thinking maybe she was just stressed about the pregnancy and being in a new place. But then things started getting weird, really weird. She began demanding that I go with her everywhere, doctor's appointments, grocery runs, even to get her nails done. At first I thought she was just nervous about being alone, so I went along with it. But then she started calling the baby our baby, and it made my skin crawl. She would call me multiple times a day saying the baby was craving food from specific restaurants and begging me to go get it for her. When I pointed out that it wasn't really our baby and suggested she could order delivery, She would say that she didn't trust delivery drivers because they might tamper with her food. She always offered to pay me back, but that wasn't the point. This became a daily thing. Even when I was in the middle of work calls, she'd text me saying our baby needed something right away. She refused to use any delivery apps because she was convinced the drivers would do something to her food. So instead, I became her personal food delivery service. The worst part was when she started making jokes about me being the baby's other parent. When we'd run into people at the store, she'd introduce me as her co-parent or say things like, "We're expecting," while rubbing her belly. I corrected her every time, but she'd just laugh it off like it was all one big joke. This went on for months. Every single day she needed something. I was basically her personal assistant, driver, and errand runner all rolled into one. My work started suffering because I was constantly interrupted by her demands. Then last week I was packing for my trip back home to Puerto Rico. My best friend is getting married, and I'm a bridesmaid. I've had this trip planned for over a year. The bridal shower, bachelorette party, rehearsal dinner, wedding, and I'm even helping her organize her new apartment while she's on her honeymoon. It's a 4-week trip, and I've been looking forward to it forever. Karen came over and saw my suitcase on the bed. She demanded to know where I was going, and when I told her about my trip home for the wedding, she said that I had never mentioned it before. I explained that I told her about this months ago and that I'd be gone for 4 weeks. That's when she completely lost it. Started screaming at me about how I was abandoning her and the baby. She said she was counting on me to be there for the birth, which was going to happen any day now. Then she dropped the real bombshell. She told me she had been planning on me moving in with her for the first month after the baby was born. She said that since I had nanny experience, I obviously knew what I was doing. And since I worked from home 2 days a week, she expected me to watch the baby on those days too. I was completely shocked. When I asked if she seriously wanted me to move in and be her live-in nanny, she got defensive and said I wouldn't be a nanny, just helping out. She said we were in this together since I've been there through the whole pregnancy, so obviously I was going to help with the baby. I told her that I was just being a friend and had never agreed to any of that. She started crying and saying she didn't have anyone else, that it was just her and the baby and me, and I couldn't abandon them now. I made it clear that I wasn't canceling my flight or cutting my trip short. This was my best friend's wedding, and I'd had these plans forever. She started crying and screaming about how I was the worst person in the world. The next day, she started posting about me on social media. Long rants about how I had betrayed her and the baby, how I was supposed to be their support system, and I just abandoned them. Her mom, who lives only 4.5 hours away in the same state, was commenting on every post agreeing with her and calling me heartless. My own mom saw the posts and called me up. She told me she saw what Karen posted and that I should be ashamed of myself. When I tried to explain that Karen expected me to move in with her and be her free nanny, my mom said that while moving in was too much, I should at least be there for the birth and help with meals when the baby came. She told me she wasn't going to pick me up from the airport because she knew I would do the right thing. Even my own mother was taking this woman's side without knowing the full story. So I took an Uber to the airport and got on my plane. I've been in Puerto Rico for 2 weeks now, and she's still posting about me. The baby was born 5 days ago, and she's been sharing photos with captions about how she had to do it all alone because her best friend abandoned her. Yesterday, one of my actual friends back home sent me screenshots of Karen's latest posts. Apparently, she's been asking random people from her apartment building to help with the baby, and she tried the same manipulation tactics on them. She told one neighbor that they were like family after they helped her carry groceries once, and asked another person to babysit because they had such a strong connection. The building manager got involved because she was basically harassing other tenants. And get this, her mom finally drove down to help and saw what Karen was really like. My friend heard that her mom was horrified by Karen's behavior and how she was treating people. Karen's social media posts have completely backfired. People started asking questions about why someone with a mother only 4.5 hours away was so dependent on an acquaintance. Others pointed out how weird it was that she expected someone to move in and provide free childcare. The comment section turned against her pretty quickly. When I get back next week, I'm planning to block her on everything. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.